George turned to take one last look at the neat log house he had lived in for all his 7 years. It seemed strange to see the door barred in the daytime, no curtains at the windows, and no chickens in the side yard. Then he turned around and swung up next to Pa on the high wooden seat of their wagon. George noticed that Pa didn't even look back. He yelled excitedly to the oxen, pulling their wagon. "Yah! Yah! Get along there! Yah!" Clouds of dust rose from the road as the big wagons slowly rolled forward. Men shouted at their oxen, and the other animals set up a frightful noise as they moved along beside the wagons. It seemed that all the animals were bellowing at once, cows mooing, pigs snorting, and sheep bleating. Pa jumped to the ground to urge his livestock on. George heard Ma inside the wagon calling goodbye to Grandpa and Grandma Boylan. Then Grandpa was walking alongside Pa. George waved goodbye, and Pa stretched out his strong, firm hand to grasp Grandpa's wrinkled one. Tears glistened in Grandpa's eyes. "Don't forget, Marcus, there's danger in them woods," Grandpa shouted above the noise. "Be careful of the Indians. Few the ones as far back as you're going to have ever heard of William Penn or his Treaty of Love. Don't let George wander from your sight." Pa grinned. "Don't worry, Pa. I'll teach George to take care of himself, and the Indians, too." And with that, the Boylan family, along with 14 other families, were off on their adventure. George didn't know whether or not Grandpa was right about the Indians, but he didn't really care. He wasn't afraid. None of those, not even of redskins. Traveling slowly into the forest, sometimes cutting their own roads as they went and moving only 4 or 5 miles a day, these pioneers could not know that the disagreements between England and America had finally reached a head, resulting in the American Revolutionary War. Soon after they left Germantown, Paul Revere, an engraver and silversmith in Massachusetts, went on his famous ride, warning the farmers of the invading English redcoats. The battles of Lexington and Concord were fought, but young George Bowen and his family heard nothing of them. They just continued to urge their oxen over the strange ground, eager to reach their new home. As night approached, they drew their wagons into a meadow or glade and allowed their livestock to graze. Then George would run with the other boys his age and gather sticks and brush for the huge bonfire the men built. They needed this fire not only for light, heat, and cooking, but to scare off the wild animals that prowled close by. When the boys saw that the fire was blazing and they had carried enough water from some nearby spring or river for their mothers, they would gather the edge of the clearing or else explore the edge of the woods for small animals or unusual insects. Sometimes they found little harmless green snakes that hid in their pockets and saved them until later in the evening when everyone had gathered around the campfire. Then they would pull out the snakes and watch all the girls scream. It worked every time. Always with George, they played when they played was George's best friend Robert Stewart. Robert was skinnier and weaker than any of the other boys, but George enjoyed looking out for him. And though he might tease Robert once in a while or playfully wrestle him to the ground, he made sure none of the other boys did anything to hurt his friend. On the 11th day out, the wagon train pulled to a halt at the top of the hill. The most beautiful country these settlers had ever seen stretched around them. Jumping from his wagon, Marcus Bowen threw up his hands and called, "This is it, folks. This is what we've been looking for. Have you ever seen such beautiful, rich land?" George caught his father's excitement. To the west and the north rose high, wooded mountains. Flowers, tall grass, and wide shade trees carpeted the valley below. "Look, Pa," George called softly. There to the right, see the fawn? The little fawn was curiously poking his head around a tree to see what these strangers wanted. A mother deer soon came behind him. She stood looking but a moment, and then they disappeared silently into the woods. Sure, son, Pa said. These woods must be filled with all sorts of wild critters. And take a look at them streams running down into the valley. They'll give us the water we need and fish to spare. The settlers climbed back into their wagons and began the slow descent to their new valley home. Marcus Boylan staked out a large piece of ground for his family's land. This section had many trees that would need to be cut, but the land was rich for farming. That night, the settlers met around the campfire to plan the work ahead of them. They decided to live in the wagons until their homes were built. They would build the cabins one at a time, all pitching in to help. The Boylan and Stewart cabins would be the first built, since these families had the youngest children. George had never been so excited. Every time he had a minute to spare, he ran to the woods for his favorite game, exploring. He discovered new kinds of trees, plants, and flowers, and some animals he'd never seen before. But every time he returned to the settlement, he noticed a worried look on his mother's face. George, I don't want you going off in them woods without your father, she finally said one day. We don't know what. Oh, Ma, George protested. I don't go far. And anyway, there's nothing back there to hurt me. But even Pa insisted that George stay away from the woods. Your ma's right, boy. What we don't know about them woods is how many Indians live there, and whether they're friendly or not. So you'd best stay close to me for a while, lestways until I can teach you something about the woods and getting along with redskins. With everybody helping, the Boylan cabin went up fast. Marcus had laid out careful plans for a large cabin, and he even built a lean-to on the back for extra storage. George and his friends worked too, mixing mud and pushing it into the chinks between the logs so cold air and snow could not blow in during the winter. At night, after the other workers had gone home, Pa would split logs in half and spend long hours making them smooth. These were to be used for the floor of the cabin. This was another job George could help do. He had an adze like Pa's, except George's was smaller. An adze looked like an axe with the head turned sideways, but it had a thinner, more curved blade for smoothing wood. Most nights the Stewarts came over, and Mr. Stewart and little Robert joined in with their adze. It seemed to George that Robert was getting weaker all the time. He'd grown thinner until his hands looked as thin and delicate as a girl's, and he had a worried look in his eye. Something bothering you, Robert? George asked one night. Well, nothing much, Robert hesitated. But I can't help being scared of the Indians out there. I hear tell they even scalp people. Mrs. Stewart came over to where the boys worked. Robert Stewart, are you talking about them Indians again? She asked. I don't want to hear you talking about them any more. You get yourself too worried up. Sure, boy, Mr. Stewart looked up from his work. The Indians aren't anything to be scared of. Probably aren't any for miles around. Then George saw Mr. Stewart wink at Pa, but he noticed that Pa didn't return the wink. He just shook his head and went back to work. Next morning, the Boylans rode down to the Stewarts' property to begin work on their cabin. The Stewarts were to be their nearest neighbors. Within minutes, the other wagons arrived, filled with people ready to work. By noon, They'd cleared land, and some of the men had already started cutting the logs for the cabin. Pa called George aside. Son, I didn't like the way Stewart was talking so lightly about the Indians last night. Truth of the matter is, there's probably a couple of them watching us all the time to see what we plan to do. They don't like people tearing up their lands, up their hunting grounds. And like your Grandpa Boylan said, they've probably never heard of William Penn's treaty around here. You mean they really are something to be afraid of, Pa? George asked. Like Robert said? Well, no, you don't have to be afraid of them, Pa spoke so slowly, seeming to choose his words carefully. You just have to be careful of them. Practice walking quietly in the woods like the Indians do. Don't step on sticks when you can help it, and step lightly and quickly. If you should see an Indian, don't cry out or run. Just take cover quickly behind a bush or some trees. And there's something else I want to tell you. Your life could depend on it, so listen carefully. If you should ever run afoul of the Indians, don't act scared. Do you hear me? Never, never show fear. Pa, that might be hard to do. I'd probably be terribly afraid. Pa looked at George sternly. Practice control, boy. Just practice. Then Pa turned and walked away. Within a few months, the pioneers had finished all the cabins and settled down to their new lives. George spent part of every day helping Pa tend to the potatoes, corn, and other vegetables they had planted soon after arriving. Evenings they spent fixing up the inside of the cabin. They made a smooth wooden dining table and even put up some shelves for the dishes Ma had brought with her. Sometimes Ma said they worked too hard. No, Prudence, Paul would answer. I took you away from a nice, comfortable home, and if God gives me the strength, I will give you a neat, good home on the frontier, too.